Ever heard of web serials? I've known of their existence for some time, but only recently decided to try one out. It's called Worm by Wildbow, and is the most popular out there, because as we know, the most popular thing is always the best. At least that's what I tried to convince myself as I went through the leftover McDonald's I had reheated before typing this. Yep, definitely the best. Where's that toilet? Anyway, Worm is brilliant. The writer develops as they go along, and it has a nice premise involving superheroes and all that. It's very readable and proceeds at a fast pace, and because of its serialized nature, there isn't a dull moment, even in the downtime. Certain fans, prone to hyperbole, will tell you that this is the greatest masterpiece in literary history, and that this unique serialized format is the only way it was possible. Those of us with a little knowledge of the history of the written word will be able to tell you that actually, no, serialization really isn't that new a thing. It was happening hundreds of years ago when people couldn't afford books, and there was a gent by the name of Charles Dickens who serialized every single one of his works in the 1800s. They're quite revered now, and I think Worm will be given enough time. It attempts to subvert expectations, and the reason it does this is because the genre it operates in was codified so fully in the early to mid 20th century that it had to. In order to stand out from the hundreds of serialized and non-serialized works, it needed to do something different. The premise of a young girl steadily growing in power and notoriety or fame has absolutely been done to death by young adult books. But Worm isn't really young adult. It injects mature themes into its first-person narrative, drawing comparisons to adult fantasy and urban fiction, instead of superhero books or comics. The writer worked on a revamped version of a novel field. The internet allowed them to grow and mature and improve and tell a story without the confines of publication, be it traditional or otherwise. And no matter what they wrote or what story they wanted to tell, they were absolutely railroaded by the unfortunate reality that they were writing this tale in the 2010s and not in the 1930s. When asked about their inspirations, the author chose to quote another author from the 1800s. I discovered this after writing about 1800s serialization, so that's a happy coincidence on my part. The quote is of course from Mark Twain, most famous for being eminently quotable and also rising from the grave in order to play himself on television series Star Trek: The Next Generation. He may have written some books too. Anyway, here's the quote. "There's no such thing as a new idea. It is impossible. We simply take a lot of old ideas and put them into a sort of mental kaleidoscope. We give them a turn and they make new and curious combinations. We keep on turning and making new combinations indefinitely. But they're the same old pieces of coloured glass that have been in use through all the ages." Wildbow was the sort of author who had been influenced by thousands, if not millions, of pieces of media consumption throughout their life. They were also consciously aware of that, and it showed. They did a good job integrating this myriad of influences into a cohesive whole, and the language means it's more approachable than past works. But when you look at the lives that some of the writers from the past lived instead of consuming media, yeah. Edgar Rice Burroughs was one I picked at random because I like his work and he was prolific, much like Wildbow, and serialized. You might know him as the creator of Tarzan. Before he was a writer, Burroughs was a soldier, a cowboy, a battery manufacturer, a miner, a railwayman, and his most stunning role of all, a pencil sharpener wholesaler. Oh, and he may have also become a pilot, for the fun of it. Point is, here was a man who had lived. And by the time he was my age, and seasoned with the experience of said living, he finally started to write. Then went off and became a war correspondent with the troops in his 60s, because he happened to be in Honolulu when the Pearl Harbor attack occurred. My belabored point about Burroughs is that he still lived in a time where that was possible, and Wildbow doesn't, and could not do all of these things even if they were from that time. Where Wildbow's creativity had to fight against the tropes and imposed norms of everything they had experienced, Burroughs was free to write whatever he pleased. He saw the quality of writing going on and said to himself, I can do that, but better. A savage human living amongst apes? Sure, sounds fun. Planetary romance with six-limbed green aliens of Barsoom? Why not? In his time, there were only a handful of quality writers to be influenced by. People like H. Rider Haggard, Rudyard Kipling, Jules Verne, and H.G. Wells. Most of his works seemed to be him industriously having fun and doing his thing, not worrying about who or what he sounded like, or whether it was even that good. He wrote uninhibited, standardizing all the pulp fiction tropes, and consequently becoming directly responsible for the comic book boom that inspired Wildbow's genre in the first place, becoming arguably the most influential writer in modern history by directly inspiring Superman, Star Wars, Indiana Jones, and Dune. What does this have to do with DOS gaming? Well, within every new medium, there comes a codifier, one who doesn't have to work within the confines of carefully managed creative expectations. One who didn't have to have several decades of seminal works in the same medium to be compared with unfavourably. Your Sid Meier's and John Carmack's and David Braben's of this world. And it just so happens that the humble disk operating system was the one sporting the most of these creative geniuses who were uninhibited by expectation, and did the things they did because they could, and wanted to push the envelope. When creativity is confined by both the expectations of a current audience and the previous high points in the medium, people who are creative cannot help but be influenced by that. It's human nature, and whether it's TIE Fighter or Tarzan, that's why you're only going to get a handful of these truly transcendent works. New frontiers will appear, but the old ground will remain covered, and even the modern films of today, like the new Avatar movie, are directly inspired by things that people wrote in the 1930s. Heroes like Flash Gordon, John Carter, and Northwest Smith are going to be echoed in perpetuity because the creatives of today are all reading from the same hymn sheet that these previous writers composed, even if they don't realize it. Nobody can make a platforming game without Mario lingering in the background of their creative process, like some kinda creepy Italian stalker. Nobody can make a first-person shooter without Doomguy's face grinning back at them. The only way to escape this is to either lean directly into it and say, yes, we're influenced by that and we wear it on our sleeves, or to do as Wildbow does, and to subvert expectations in a manner that doesn't feel like subversion for the sake of subversion, a delicate balance that takes a really skillful navigator to pull off. Now, back to reading Worm. This Wildbow guy can really write. Reminds me of a classic combination of Alan Moore or Garth Ennis, Jim